evening. My name is Tina Yin, and for the next few minutes, I'm going to be a sort of stereotypical teenager. So, this is what teenage life has been all about. Figuring out whether Kim K or T Swizzle is the true snake. Oh, fighting with my parents about chores, homework, and of course, curfews. Assessing whether the dab or the nay-nay are better dance moves. Oh, and of course, balancing the perils of our teenaged, hormone-infused social interactions. By now, many of you may have noticed something a bit off about my presentation. When what I was saying didn't coincide with what was happening on the screen behind me, there was a bit of a disconnect. See, that same disconnect actually exists in our own teenage lives. As I was engulfed in my list of teenage angst and concerns, I let all of that in the background fade away. See, as I was a one-year-old and the planes crashed into the Twin Towers on 9/11, I would officially grow up in what modern-day historians consider the age of terror. And as my phone buzzes to news alerts of bombings in the Middle East, uprisings in South America, HIV, tuberculosis, cholera, terror in the Western Hemisphere, the broken politics of America, I grew up watching news of broken promises in a broken world. And see, we as teenagers for the next generation are supposed to be the optimistic hope, to fight bigotry and fix society. But this disconnect right here seems to be where we have reached a problem. And although I'm not speaking to every single teenager out there, I am speaking to many of us, including my 9th grade self. See, I stumbled upon this realization when my brother one day spontaneously asked me the question, "Can you name 3 things happening in the world right now?" And of course, as my prideful know-it-all 9th grade self, I had to have an answer. It was a simple enough question. But as I scoured my mind for the perfect, articulate answer, the only one I could come up with was ISIS? See, my brother didn't need to say another word or do anything else. He had made his point quite clear. I simply did not know or care enough about current events. And this realization planted a bit of a seed of guilt within me. The seed of guilt urged me to turn on CNN instead of The Bachelor. This seed of guilt pestered me to click on a few news headlines, a few news articles a day. And as the news headlines grew to be 3 or 4 or 5, I got more curious. I delved deeper. I started reading books. I started reading essays, and soon enough, reading, learning, and debating current events became a larger and larger part of my life. And as learning about current events invoked my passions and curiosities and care for the world, I also started to notice that the knowledge of current events didn't really speak to much value in my community. One day I was wandering around Shanghai with some of my friends. We'd come across these panda donation boxes. These panda donation boxes had reminded me of an article I had read about the increase in civic duty in China. And as I saw these panda boxes, I decided I wanted to go on a spiel about the fascinating article I had read, obviously. I was quickly dismissed by my friends in remarks like, "Oh my goodness, Tina, like, who cares? They're just panda donation boxes." Yeah, who reads news like that? I mean, please, get a life. It was really just for fun, and I realized that none of these things were actually meant to hurt me, and they didn't. I knew they were just poking fun at my inherent dorkiness. But to some extent, I knew that they had a lack of care. Discussion would prove to be even more rare. I constantly feel myself holding back on bringing up conversation topics about something overly important, in fear that it'll make my friends bored, or in knowledge that they might not actually care. And even on the rare occasions that discussion does happen, well, it seems to be treated with jadedness. On the first day of a summer course I had taken, the professor asked the class, "How many of you think that there is nothing you can do about all the bad things that are happening in the world right now?" 12 of the 14 students answered in agreement. So how are we supposed to fix the world as the generation of the future with this kind of attitude? When did current events become dismissible background noise? When was the last time you had a conversation about something going on in the world, like a real conversation? Let's take ISIS for an example. ISIS is probably one of the most well-known current events. So, you know that ISIS is a terrorist group, but did you know that Boko Haram is also a terrorist group? In fact, they caused more deaths than ISIS did in the past year. You know that ISIS is a terrorist group, but what makes them so dangerous? They're certainly not the only terrorist group or the most deadly terrorist group. Where do they base their beliefs? And before you use the term Islamic and Islamist and mistaken one for the other, well, what are the differences between Islamic and Islamist? See, that right there, that gap in understanding, those unanswered questions, that's where this takes place. That's where this disconnect happens. See, when we read news, we gain sympathy and empathy and understanding. We bridge this gap in misunderstanding. And we break down the walls of ignorance. When we read a little more, learn a little more, get to know the world a little better, our world gets a little bit bigger. See, we as a society have gotten fairly good at avoiding blame for problems, myself included. And who can blame us? I mean, since we were about this little, we were taught to put our fingers on our noses and scream, "Not me!" And nowadays, we just point our fingers at the big guys, at the UN conferences, to fight our wars and fix our problems. But as we complain that they are not doing a good enough job, I think many of us fail to realize that this is actually our responsibility. The bigotry and fear that we see in the world today isn't something detached from our lives. As a matter of fact, it's actually something that is fostered in the society that we make up. The solution to our big problems are not bigger guns and bigger legislation. It occurs in the little corners of our little communities, within each and every one of us. It doesn't take making a speech at the United Nations to have your voice heard, because every voice is heard, right? By those standing right beside you. So why don't we make our voices count? See, that's the thing, right? Why don't we make our voices count? We ask these questions a lot. So why don't we click on a news article? Here's a news article. You can click on one, and maybe we'll be interested in it. And then maybe we'll share it with someone else. And after we share it with someone else, maybe a discussion will happen. And there the discussion happens, and that's where the disconnect is bridged. See, our society today hasn't been dealt a bad hand at all. In fact, we've been dealt one of the best hands yet in history. So why do we keep excusing ourselves? Why do we keep excusing ourselves from getting to know the world a little better? Getting to know the world like getting to know a friend. I mean, everyone's dream is for a better world, right? So I leave you with this question. Can you tell me 3 things happening in the world right now? Tell me more. Why not? Thank you.